when I was writing Play the Fool, I ended up just sort of reaching out to local law enforcement, just in my village, um, to kind of try and talk to some cops and try and get a little bit of realism for the law enforcement aspects of my book. And I don't think anybody is really going to call my book some kind of police procedural. I don't think the details are quite that realistic. But in my view, I feel like it doesn't have to be real as long as it sounds real or seems real. So really what I wanted from these cops is to sort of figure out how they spoke, how they felt about their jobs, what the mundane details were of their job that would make it seem real. It was almost, I even told some of these cops, like I would record conversations and I would say, I don't even care what you talk about. I'm just listening to you talk, basically. And so that was and that was when I enrolled in this Citizens Police Academy class, which I think was probably kind of like a PR effort. Because at that time, this was about 10 years ago, it was 2014, 15. Cops were kind of having a rough time in the media, as they still are quite a bit. And so I think a lot of police departments were doing these sort of like meet and greet classes to kind of show that, they weren't the monsters that everyone was seeing on TV. And that was a very educational class for me. It was like a 12-week, once a week class where you got to see all different kinds of stuff, how to process a crime scene, what happens on a traffic stop, some of the behind the scenes stuff. It was really fascinating. And I got to meet a lot of interesting cops and kind of see what the different attitudes were and stuff like that. But again, the most fascinating thing to me were things that they perhaps didn't intend on revealing, like the office politics and just like all the sort of like dirt in between the civic departments and stuff like that. That was the stuff that I found really interesting. And so, um, by a complete coincidence, while I was doing all this research, this was in 2015, there was this incident in a nearby town, where a very, very celebrated veteran police officer was killed. And because I was already involved with some of these cops, I kind of got a front row seat to the investigation. So I kind of got to shadow some of these cops that were doing this work, and it was incredible. It was a story that made the national news. There were, the FBI came in, the federal marshals came in, the ATF. All of these federal agencies kind of descended upon this tiny little lake town where I live, and it just exploded all over the news because the story was so compelling. This hero cop, 30-year veteran of the force, family man, youth leader. He was just such a beloved community figure. And may I remind you, this was in 2015. We had just had the protest in Baltimore earlier that year. Like it was really kind of everything was around cops was kind of getting to a fever pitch. And so the public really just kind of went nuts with this story. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was sort of keeping in touch with these cops that were investigating it. And very, very quickly, things started to come out that completely undercut the image that this guy had cultivated all these years. And and the story was incredible. It was the kind of stuff that you just could not make up. And so even back then, even as soon as it happened, I knew I was going to write about it someday. I just didn't know exactly how. So when it came time to write Tricks of Fortune, um, the story was still kind of bubbling around in my head. And it just seemed like a natural fit because, like I was saying, I feel like this series is really all about storytelling and kind of the stories that we tell each other about the people we love, about people out in the world, and how those stories can sometimes be resistant to change, but also how they can just completely turn on their face when they don't suit us anymore. And I feel like that's what happened in real life. And that's also what I tried to reflect in Tricks of Fortune. Early on, when I was first conceiving of Play the Fool, I actually toyed with the idea of making Katie a real psychic, or like a quote unquote real, having this be sort of like a speculative novel and having her um, giving her actual powers. And I actually found that it was a lot more compelling to just have her be a real person who is very intuitive and who uses this sort of image of tarot cards that can be kind of mystical or whatever, to try and to just use that as another tool in her arsenal. And so at the beginning of the novel, at this point, Katie and Jamie have already kind of fallen into this relationship where they just sort of they kind of solve these cases together unofficially. And I explain it better in the novel where they've just sort of gotten to rely on each other's um, different abilities in this sphere where, as I was saying, Jamie kind of relies on logic and Katie kind of relies on intuition. In fact, they have this conversation at the beginning of the novel where she jokes about how you know what your problem is, Jamie. She says, you know, you're too focused on things that make sense, that things that you've tried before that work. You need to try something that makes absolutely no sense. And she's kind of kidding, but she's kind of not. And Jamie has, even though he's very logical, kind of accepted that this is a limitation of his, and that he and Katie kind of work together in this way that allows both of them to um, get further along than they would have on their own. I didn't realize this as it was happening, but I've been told that I have a lot of characters in this novel, and that it gets kind of confusing. I didn't. It seemed very clear to me, but you know, I was too close to it, perhaps. So yeah, the story basically follows very loosely the trajectory of the real case, which is that this hero cop gets killed, and Katie ends up sort of being involved in helping Jamie with the investigation because he's officially involved in this investigation. She is unofficially involved. Now, she actually has a connection to this police officer because when she was a baby, he saved her life in a car accident. And this was sort of the beginning of his kind of heroic image. This is sort of, in a way, she kind of made him who he ended up being. And they're sort of entangled in this way for the rest of their lives. And so she feels very motivated to solve this case and figure out what happened. But he also, because they had been connected early on in this way, she's sort of connected to his family as well. And he has a son who's right about her age, who she ends up kind of growing up with in a way. And they have this very sort of hazy, undefined kind of relationship. She and the cop's son become sort of entangled also in this investigation because obviously he wants to know what happened to his dad, and they still have this connection from childhood that they begin to kind of explore now that they're adults. I think there is probably some tension there. There's definitely some tension there because I intended there to be. But I think they both kind of realize that perhaps their relationship is a little bit too valuable for them to kind of confuse with any kind of romantic feelings, although it's pretty clear that some form of those romantic feelings is definitely there.